Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. Time to see then what is making the headlines with the new Statesman's deputy online editor, Rachel Cunliffe, and the chief executive of Conservative Home, Mark Wallace. Welcome to you. Staying with us, I know, right through until just before midnight. So let's check out the front pages then. Starting with the Financial Times, they're covering the government's decision to increase national insurance contributions as a means of funding social care. The FT reporting the Prime Minister will be looking to quell a possible rebellion from within his own Conservative ranks in an effort to get the legislation through Parliament. The Telegraph suggests the changes will lead to the highest taxes since the Second World War. The Times, with the same focus, tax burden will rise to the highest in 70 years. The Sun describes the move as Bojo's biggest gamble. Similarly, The Guardian questions whether the plan will deliver as the PM stakes his reputation on the £12 billion plan. The Daily Mail pleads, now make the care worth the cost, Boris. The Metro calls the government tax and spend Tories. And referring to the abandonment of the pensions triple lock, the Star pictures an elderly couple at a bus stop remarking, you don't break a manifesto pledge for ages, then two come along at the same time. So let's get the thoughts then. Rachel Cunliffe and Mark Wallace are here with me now. And Mark, big gamble, big bill. How, as a Conservative supporter, are you feeling tonight?
Pretty uncomfortable about this in various different ways. I mean, firstly, that question of, you see it reflected in various of the papers, the idea of high taxing Tories is not something I think is particularly sensible. The route in particular that's been chosen, I was writing about this yesterday, in fact, national insurance is a tax that really ought not to exist. You know, it's a giant con that's been perpetrated on the British people for decades. The idea that there's this insurance scheme and you pay into your pot and eventually you get out what you've paid in for was true once upon a time. It hasn't been true for decades. National insurance is another form of income tax, effectively income tax, the sequel. Now it's expensive. And as a result, that's one reason why governments of all stripes have found it easier to mess with national insurance, with the result, of course, that it applies to poorer workers and younger workers disproportionately in ways that we don't think are acceptable for straight-up income tax.
And Rachel, this levy will be hypothecated, to use the official phrase, or ring-fenced, as we might describe it, for this Parliament at least. But as the Daily Mail discusses in their Now Make the Care Worth the Cost, Boris, the whole point of this is actually the health service is the main focus for the first few years.
Yes, most of this money that is being billed as pay a little bit more tax in order to save the social care system isn't going into social care at all. It's going into the NHS. So the idea that this is the plan that we've waited 2 years for, since Boris Johnson stood outside Downing Street on his first day as Prime Minister and said, we have a plan to save social care, to fix the social care crisis. That plan doesn't seem to actually be fixing the problem that it was meant to. It seems to be doing something else. Interesting as well that later that same year, 2019, Boris Johnson went into a general election running on a manifesto of not increasing taxes, not increasing national insurance, but of fixing the social care system. Now, a lot of political commentators, a lot of Westminster watchers were very keen to find out what that social care plan was that didn't involve raising taxes. And now we find 2 years later, under the cover of the pandemic, which we all agree was unprecedented, but that plan didn't exist, and that what the government is doing, as Mark said, is increasing taxes by 10%, by the way, which none of the papers have cited that figure, but it's going up from 12% for most people to 13.25%, which is a tax increase of 10%, in order to solve a problem that the government told us 2 years ago it already had a plan to solve.
Yes, and do you think most people will excuse his apparent untruths, Mark, with his phraseology, a global pandemic was on nobody's manifesto? These are unforeseeable times.
Well, the thing is, I think there's very widespread understanding of the fact that the pandemic is exceptional circumstances, and in the circumstance of a natural disaster, a pandemic, a major war, God forbid, something like that, people have some leeway they're willing to offer to politicians for the idea that plans made in peacetime, as it were, to a certain extent, are going to be sideswiped by that. But there is a limit on the amount of leeway they're going to be willing to give. Particularly, I think, whether it's this announcement, whether it's another one down the line, when it stops seeming like an explanation and starts seeming like an excuse, by that point it will have become too late. And that is the risk. Any politician breaking a manifesto pledge has, is taking a risk. It's not that it's, these are not legally binding documents for a very good reason, which is the governments do need to be able to react to circumstance, setting aside whether I like this particular policy or not. But you've got to be very careful with how you do it and how long, particularly if you want to stand for election again.
Yes, and do you think many people will think actually this was fairly politically astute? Where was all the Tory furore that we saw in the weekend papers, for example, as we look ahead to the vote on Wednesday, that actually entwining social care with great support for the NHS and all the hard work that people have done and the great needs of people and that massive backlog, that has helped, do you think, keep those Tories who might complain about this quiet? Or will we see dissent tomorrow, Rachel?
I think to a certain extent, Boris Johnson has covered his tracks. Just because people don't realise that you're scamming them doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. I think the fact that we have various papers citing 3 cabinet ministers who spoke out very strongly against these plans but are unnamed cabinet sources and didn't feel that it was for them to resign or take a stand over this issue just says something about the level of integrity among cabinet ministers at the moment. I think conflating these issues and saying it's about social care, but it's also about our NHS. You want more money for our NHS, don't you? You want more money for the doctors and nurses, don't you? It's a form of emotional blackmail, and it enables you to break promises, to make economic illiterate decisions, and we can come on a bit later as to why a national insurance rise is a particularly abhorrent way of raising this money, under the cover of, if anyone disagrees with you, it's because they don't like the NHS or they don't like the doctors and nurses who work in the NHS, which is very cynical, and it might work. As Mark said, people don't seem to realise that national insurance is a form of income tax, and this is a tax rise on working people. Will he get away with it? Probably, just because I think Labour's very weak at the moment, and I think it's not like anyone else had a different solution to social care. But again, that doesn't make it right, and that doesn't make it any more justifiable just because he might get away with it.
Yes, and many people pointing out that the high levels of taxation, which is the front page of the Daily Telegraph, is absolutely inevitable given our ageing population, never mind the costs of the pandemic. But let's take a look at that Daily Telegraph front page, Mark. The words there of their associate editor, Camilla Tominey. We have just witnessed the Prime Minister sound the death knell for conservatism. Is that fair? I know David Gauke, a former cabinet minister, till he fell on the wrong side of the Brexit debate, suggested actually, yes, certainly the Tories want to be the party of low taxation, but they are also fiscally conservative, which means balancing the books, which is what this policy does.
Well, yes, David Gauke, I should say, also a Conservative Home columnist. You can read his contributions on our website. But this is, to a certain extent, there's always a little bit of a dilemma within the history of conservatism. The fact is that divergence or that tension sometimes, as you say, between balancing the books and not wanting to raise taxes too high. But we must face the fact this could become a really fundamental issue for the Conservatives as the party of low taxes, with a major opposition party, the Labour Party, seeking to get back to being a potential party of government. Traditionally, the party proudly of higher taxes. It's all very well to say, oh well, moving on to Labour's turf, stealing their territory. Well, part of that, if it involves abandoning part of what people view as essential to your own brand, that's a really fundamental problem. Many people want a lower tax option. Of course, low taxes aren't just some kind of item of dogma. They help to create growth. They help to create jobs. They help to also do something ethical, which is leave more people's own money in their own pocket for them to spend as they choose.
Well, certainly that's been one of the criticisms, that if you go via the route of national insurance, it becomes a tax on jobs because employers also have to pay. Do they pass those costs on? Do they pay people less? The other big criticism, of course, is unfair in terms of intergenerational divides. The government has targeted pensioners via if you are a working pensioner, you now need to pay national insurance under these plans, that dividends will also see a tax increase, and also the triple lock suspended for 1 year, which is the subject of a rather humorous Daily Star, rather, Rachel.
Well, firstly, I wanted to say thanks to Mark for mentioning that David Gork also writes columns. He wrote one for the New Statesman recently, pointing out that, about social care and about how the way we view fairness and unfairness with this particular issue is very, very strange. We somehow think it is unfair to ask people who have substantial assets, who perhaps own their own homes that might be worth more than £1 million, which is a fifth of all pensioner households have assets worth more than £1 million. We think it's unfair to ask them to contribute to their own care costs, but we think it is perfectly fair to ask working age people, working age families who might be on the minimum wage to increase the taxes that they pay in order to make sure that those wealthy people can stay in their homes and pass that wealth on to their children in the form of inheritances. So the fact that this is an issue that is uniting the left and the right and all different strands of rebels on the Conservative Party and beyond, I think is quite something. The Daily Star noting, as you said, that they're also making tweaks to the triple lock. It's going to be very, very, very slightly less generous than it usually is. It's going to be a double lock instead, still rising by more than workers' wages are rising. But the
Apologies, we're just running out of time. Let's go to a small story that makes the front page of the Daily Telegraph. This is the AstraZeneca boss who cautions against rushing to boosters. What do we know from this, well, précis of an article, Mark?
Well, we know a little. As you say, it's a note from the front of the Telegraph, but it does hint at a kind of wider debate that I think is yet to rage a little bit more, given everything else that's been going on, which is about the balance of cost and benefit, exactly where these boosters are going to be allocated. For that matter, are they best being used in this country, or are they best being used to help people in other countries who don't have access to vaccines at all in some cases?
Yes, and I suppose AstraZeneca is one of the big vaccines which has gone global, and certainly to some of the emerging countries as well. And meantime, of course, this article also points out that the chief medical officers are deciding on the wider implications of jabbing youngsters, young people, and the Telegraph suggesting we could hear as early as Wednesday for that, Rachel.
Yes, it should be clear, jabbing teenagers with their parents' consent, not just going into schools and doing it. Obviously, this is a very key issue at the moment because schools have just gone back and there's a real worry about infection levels rising in poorly ventilated schools. They have had all summer to come up with a plan on this, so it's interesting they're only just doing it now. But the other interesting thing about the AstraZeneca boss warning is pointing out that it's not just about the amount of vaccines, it's also about time and resources and making sure that people get other healthcare services that they need, flu jabs or cancer screenings, and that all of the NHS effort isn't used up on a booster rollout, which may make us feel safer, but might not have the widespread benefits that people would hope that it would.
Sorry to rush you again. I do apologise. Rachel Cunliffe, Mark Wallace, thank you both very much indeed.